Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive.
It's great to be here.
Today we're going to be looking at something that sounds pretty basic on the surface,
Yeah,
but it gets really interesting when you start to think about all the implications.
yeah, absolutely.
So we're talking about inaction as an action.
Right.
It might seem kind of like a paradox.
Yeah,
How can doing nothing actually be doing something?
right.
But our listener sent us this document called
Inaction is an action.
Inaction as an Action, yeah.
Yeah,
And they're super curious about how this concept plays out in relationships.
makes sense.
So we're going to dive deep into all of that,
Awesome.
explore the psychology of inaction,
Yeah.
how it can trip us up in our relationships,
Hmm.
and what we can do to avoid those pitfalls.
I love it.
So let's start by unpacking this whole idea of inaction being an active choice.
Okay.
The Inaction is an Action document kicks off with this concept.
Right.
And they use some pretty powerful examples to illustrate it. Like, imagine there's a conflict brewing between two people you care about,
Okay.
and you decide to stay out of it.
Yeah.
On the surface, it seems like you're being neutral.
Right.
But in reality,
Hmm.
by not taking a side, you're actually making a choice.
Absolutely.
You're choosing to support whatever the status quo is,
It's true.
even if you don't agree with it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's so interesting about this concept, right? It
Yeah.
challenges the whole idea of neutrality.
Right.
Like, we think that if we're not doing anything,
Yeah.
we're not having an impact.
Right.
But in reality, it's impossible to be truly neutral.
I agree.
Because even when we choose to do nothing,
Yeah.
we're still exerting a force.
Yeah.
We're still influencing the situation in some
Yeah.
way.
Absolutely.
So let's say you have a big decision to make.
Okay.
Maybe it's about a job offer,
Mhm.
a relationship,
Yeah.
anything important.
Okay.
And instead of facing it head on,
Yeah.
you just keep putting it off,
Procrastinator.
procrastinate, telling yourself you need more time to think.
Yeah.
But that delay, that's inaction too.
Exactly.
And often it ends up making the situation even more complicated.
It's like that old saying, not to decide, is to decide.
Right.
By delaying the decision, you're basically deciding to let outside forces determine the outcome.
Instead of taking control yourself.
That's exactly.
So the next question is, why do we choose to do nothing sometimes?
Right.
I mean, we all do it.
All the time.
I know I've definitely been guilty of avoiding tough conversations
Sure.
or putting off projects
Mm-hmm.
because they just felt too overwhelming
Yeah.
or uncomfortable.
It's natural.
Yeah. And the document actually digs into this whole psychology of inaction
Okay.
and explains that it's often a way of coping with difficult emotions.
It makes sense.
What do you think, listener?
Yeah. Can you relate?
Have you ever chosen to do nothing to avoid something you just didn't want to deal with?
It happens.
So one of the theories that they talk about in the document that explains this tendency is called decision paralysis.
Oh, yeah.
And it basically means that when we're faced with too many choices,
Yeah.
it can actually overwhelm us
Mm-hmm.
and make us freeze up.
For sure.
So instead of picking an option,
Mm-hmm.
we choose nothing at all
Right.
because we're so scared of making the wrong choice.
Right.
Have you ever experienced that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Oh my gosh, all the time.
so many times.
It's like when I'm trying to pick a restaurant
Yes.
with a group of friends
Yeah.
and everyone has different preferences.
Yeah.
It's like suddenly pizza delivery seems like the only safe option.
It's just easier than
Why-
trying to please everyone
Yeah.
and potentially make someone unhappy.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So it feels safer to just avoid the decision altogether
it does.
than to risk that discomfort or disappointment or conflict.
Absolutely.
The document also talks about another theory called learned helplessness.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
This one's a little bit heavier.
It is a little heavier.
It suggests that if we experience repeated failures in our lives,
Or situations where we feel powerless,
yeah,
we start to internalize this belief that our efforts just don't matter.
right,
So we kind of give up.
and resign ourselves to inaction
Right.
because we figure, why bother?
Yeah.
Why even try?
What's the point?
Yeah,
And this is a really important concept to understand when we're talking about relationships, right?
absolutely.
Because if someone's been in relationships where they've been constantly criticized
Right.
or unheard,
Yeah.
they might start to withdraw.
And avoid engaging
Yeah.
because they've learned that their voice doesn't actually make a difference.
So they just stop trying,
Yeah,
which is heartbreaking to think about,
it is.
but it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And then there's this other thing that they talk about in the document called omission bias,
Oh, interesting.
which they describe as this kind of quirk of human psychology,
Right.
where we tend to judge harmful actions
Mm-hmm.
way more harshly
Than harmful inaction.
than harmful inaction.
Even if doing nothing leads to a negative outcome,
Yeah.
it somehow feels less bad
Right.
than actively doing something that causes harm.
Like, it's not our fault.
Right.
If we didn't actually do anything.
It's like we have this built-in bias towards passivity.
It's easier.
Yeah.
It's less risky.
So you can see how all of these psychological forces are at play,
Right.
making inaction seem like the easier path, the
Yeah.
less scary path.
Mm-hmm.
But the document doesn't sugarcoat things.
No.
It's very clear about how this tendency to avoid delay
Yeah.
or stay silent
Right.
can actually backfire on us,
Especially in relationships.
especially in our relationships.
Yeah.
That's where we're heading next,
Okay.
exploring how inaction can become what they call the silent killer of connection.
Ooh, that's a good one.
So buckle up, listener.
Yeah.
Because this is where things get really real.
This is going to be good. Yeah, so we've been talking about some of the psychological roots of inaction.
Right.
But it's not just an individual thing, right?
No, absolutely not.
Like, inaction as an action really gets into how this plays out in relationships.
It does.
And it uses this really powerful phrase,
Yeah.
the silent killer of connection.
It's a very striking phrase.
It is.
It sounds a little dramatic at first,
Yeah,
but the more you think about it,
right.
the more it makes sense.
The more it rings true.
Because healthy relationships require us to put in the effort
They do.
to be present,
Yeah.
to communicate,
To be vulnerable.
to be vulnerable.
You show up.
And when we choose inaction,
Right.
whether it's avoiding tough conversations
Yeah.
or not pulling our weight,
Uh-huh.
we're sending a message that we're not fully invested.
It's like we're saying,
Yeah.
this relationship isn't that important to me.
Exactly.
And that can be so damaging over time.
It really can.
So one of the most common ways that inaction shows up in relationships,
Yeah.
according to the document,
Okay.
is avoiding those difficult conversations. Oh, yeah.
You know when something's bothering you,
Uh-huh.
but instead of talking to your partner about it,
Right.
you just sweep it under the rug
Yeah.
and hope it'll go away on its own.
We all know that doesn't work.
Of course not.
It never does.
But we do it anyway.
We try.
Right.
We hope for the best.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, hope is not a strategy.
Exactly.
So what happens when we avoid conflict in relationships?
Well, it doesn't actually make the problem go away.
No.
It just festers.
Yeah.
It creates resentment
Right.
and tension,
Yeah.
and it erodes trust.
It becomes this kind of elephant in the room
Right.
that just keeps getting bigger
Exactly.
and heavier,
Yeah.
and eventually it just takes over the whole relationship.
Until you can't ignore it anymore.
Right.
And then it explodes.
And that's never pretty.
No, it's not.
And it's not just about avoiding conflict.
Right.
The document also talks about inaction in terms of shirking responsibility,
Mhm.
like not contributing equally to household chores
Mm.
or emotional support
Yeah.
or decision-making.
All the things that go into making a relationship work,
Right.
when one person isn't pulling their weight,
Yeah.
it creates this imbalance
Okay.
where one person feels like they're doing all the work
And the other person feels resentful.
and taken for granted.
It's like one person is rowing the boat
Yeah.
and the other person is just sitting there enjoying the ride.
Sipping a cocktail,
Right.
not even offering to help steer.
Exactly.
And that's not a recipe for a successful voyage.
Inaction is an action. Also calls out another sneaky form of inaction.
Oh, tell me more.
That could be super damaging in relationships.
Okay.
Passive-aggressive behavior.
Oh, yeah. Passive aggression.
It might seem like inaction on the surface.
Right.
Because you're not directly addressing the issue.
Yeah.
But underneath, it's all about expressing your anger or frustration in a really indirect way.
Which can be so confusing
And frustrating.
and hurtful.
For the other person.
It's like you're trying to have a conversation through a wall.
Right.
You never know where the other person really stands.
And it makes it almost impossible to have a healthy, productive conversation.
It's a recipe for miscommunication.
So passive aggression is definitely something to watch out for
It is.
in our relationships.
I'm sure.
Because it can really erode that foundation of trust.
And open communication.
The document also touches on how fear of intimacy
Okay.
can lead to inaction in relationships.
Interesting.
And this one can be really subtle,
Yeah,
but it can be just as destructive as those other forms of inaction.
absolutely.
It's that hesitancy to fully open up to your partner,
Right.
to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
to let them truly see you.
Because you're afraid of getting hurt.
Exactly.
So you hold back.
You keep your distance.
You don't share your true feelings.
You don't let them in.
And over time,
Right.
that creates a wall between you.
It's like you're building a fortress around your heart
Yeah.
to protect yourself from getting hurt.
But the irony is,
Yeah.
that wall also prevents you from experiencing true intimacy,
And connection.
which is what we all crave in relationships.
So we've covered a lot of heavy stuff here.
We have.
The psychology of inaction,
Yeah.
the ways it can sabotage our relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And it can feel kind of daunting, right?
It can.
But the good news is that inaction is an action. Doesn't just diagnose the problem.
Right.
It gives us some tools to overcome it.
It offers solutions.
So are you ready to shift gears and talk about what we can do about all of this?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right. So we've talked about all the ways that inaction can mess us up.
Yeah, it's a lot.
But now let's get to the good stuff.
Right, the solutions.
Because inaction is an action doesn't just point out the problem. It
Yeah.
actually gives us some really concrete advice
Mm.
on how to recognize those patterns of inaction.
Right.
And more importantly, how to break free from them.
Yes. Let's get into that.
So the first step, as with most things in life,
Yeah.
is self-awareness.
Self-awareness, it's so important.
It's about noticing those moments when we're tempted to shut down
Right.
or withdraw.
Or just avoid.
Yeah, or just let things slide.
Instead of facing them head on.
Exactly.
It's like hitting that pause button
Uh-huh.
and asking yourself, okay, what's going on here? Why am I hesitating?
Right. What's the fear behind my inaction?
It's about getting curious about our own patterns.
Because sometimes we're not even aware of them.
We're on autopilot.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
just going through the motions.
So once we start to recognize those patterns of inaction,
Right.
the document gives us some strategies for breaking free.
Okay.
And one that I found really helpful
Yeah.
is the idea of setting incremental goals.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Because I know personally I get super overwhelmed
You too?
when I think about tackling a big task all at once.
It's too much.
It's like my brain just shuts down.
Yeah. And then we end up doing nothing.
Exactly.
So break it down.
Yeah, make it smaller.
Make it manageable.
Like if I break it down into smaller, more manageable steps,
Yeah.
suddenly it doesn't feel so daunting.
It feels achievable.
Yeah.
It's like climbing a mountain.
Okay, I like that analogy.
If you're just staring at the summit,
Right?
it can feel impossible.
I'm never going to get there.
But if you focus on the next base camp,
Yeah.
the next step,
Suddenly it feels doable.
yeah, one step at a time.
And that same principle applies to relationships too.
It does.
If there's a big issue you need to address with your partner,
Mm-hmm.
don't try to solve it all at once.
Right.
Break it down.
Start with one small piece
Yeah, like start by just expressing how you feel about one specific aspect of the issue.
and see where the conversation goes from there.
Exactly.
You don't have to have all the answers right away.
Inaction is an action also talks about the importance of embracing imperfection.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
And this is especially important for people who struggle with perfectionism
Absolutely.
because we get so caught up in wanting to make the perfect decision
Right.
or have the perfect plan
And then we end up doing nothing.
because we're so scared of messing things up.
It's paralyzing.
It is. It's that analysis paralysis.
It just gets stuck.
Yeah, and you're weighing every possible outcome.
Trying to control every...
But the truth is,
Yeah.
there's no such thing as a risk-free decision.
Never.
So sometimes
Yeah.
good enough is actually better than perfect
Way better.
because at least you're moving forward.
You're taking action.
Right. You're not just stuck.
It's about progress over perfection.
I love that.
And too.
And the document also emphasizes the importance of seeking support.
Oh, yeah. Support is crucial.
When you're struggling with inaction,
Absolutely.
it's a reminder that we don't have to go it alone.
You're not meant to.
Whether it's a trusted friend,
Yeah.
a therapist,
A mentor.
a mentor.
Sometimes just having someone to talk to
Yeah.
can make all the difference.
Just to get a different perspective
right.
or some encouragement.
Or just to hold you accountable
Yeah.
and remind you of your goals.
So we've been talking about how inaction plays out on a personal level,
Mm-hmm.
but the document takes it a step further
Okay.
and connects this idea to the wider world.
It's all connected.
It reminds us that this isn't just about our individual choices.
Right.
It's about how our collective inaction
Or silence.
can shape
Yeah.
the world around us.
So if we really believe that inaction is a choice with consequences,
Yeah.
then we have to acknowledge that staying silent,
When we see injustice
right, or inequality,
or harm,
yeah, when we see bad things happening around us.
it's a choice that reinforces those systems.
It's like that quote from Elie Wiesel.
Oh, yeah.
Indifference, to me, is the epitome of evil.
It's powerful,
It's a reminder that doing nothing,
especially when we have the power to speak up.
yeah, or to take action,
It can be a form of complicity.
So inaction as an action really challenges us,
To look at those areas where our silence might be contributing to a problem.
or at least preventing a solution. It's a call to action.
It is
It's about recognizing that we have a choice.
to be passive bystanders
Or active participants.
in shaping the world we want to live in.
It's about taking responsibility.
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive.
It has.
We've explored the psychology of inaction
The ways it impacts our relationships.
and how it ripples out into the wider world.
Inaction as an action has given us a lot to think about.
And some practical tools to help us break free from the trap of inaction.
So that we can become more deliberate actors in our own lives.
But before we wrap up,
Yeah.
I want to touch on something that's been on my mind.
Okay.
The document mentions this concept of wu-wei in Taoism,
Oh, interesting.
which translates to effortless action or non-action,
Yeah, it sounds a little paradoxical.
especially in the context of everything we've been talking about.
Right.
So how do you make sense of that?
Well, it's not about passivity
Okay.
or laziness.
Mm-hmm.
It's more about finding a balance between action and non-action.
Wow.
It's about acting in alignment with the natural flow of things.
So not forcing things.
Exactly.
Going with the flow.
Moving with the current.
It's about choosing our actions wisely.
Yes.
And sometimes that means surrendering control.
And trusting the process.
This deep dive has been incredible.
It has.
And I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
There's just so much more to explore.
Listener, we encourage you to check out the sources listed in the Inaction is an Action document
Yeah, they're really insightful.
to dive deeper into all of this.
And keep the conversation going.
But before we go,
Mhm.
what's the one key takeaway you want to leave our listener with today?
I would say it's this. We always have a choice.
Yeah.
Even when we feel stuck.
Yeah,
Uncertain.
we have the power to act.
Or not act.
And the more we understand the forces that
Mm.
influence our choices,
Both internal and external.
the better equipped we are.
To make those choices consciously.
With intention.
And create the life we want.
Beautifully said. So, listener, as you move through your day,
Your week.
your life,
Remember that inaction, it's our to action.
choose wisely.
And keep